The rubble of Cherbourg still smoked when they marched him toward the harbor. Oberleutnant Walter Hallstein, once a law professor who lectured on order and justice, now stood in a column of defeated men, his artillery unit destroyed, his uniform torn, his future erased. Weeks earlier, from a hillside above the Normandy coast, he had watched something no propaganda minister in Berlin could ever explain away. A horizon black with ships, a sky so thick with aircraft it seemed to hum without pause. He told himself it was an illusion, a trick of distance and fear. It was not. On the 26th of June 1944, American soldiers took him prisoner. He expected punishment. He expected hunger. He expected the fate Nazi doctrine had always promised awaited any German who fell into enemy hands. Cruelty, starvation, humiliation. Instead, within weeks, he would board a ship bound for a country he had been taught was weak, decadent, and collapsing under the weight of its own excess. What Walter Hallstein was about to discover on the other side of the Atlantic would not simply contradict everything he believed. It would quietly, irreversibly rebuild him into a different man, one who would one day help rebuild an entire continent. Before the war, Walter Hallstein had spent his days inside lecture halls, not trenches. He had built a career on words, on contracts, on statutes, on the architecture of law that held a civilized society together. At the University of Rostock, and later at Frankfurt, he had taught generations of students that order came from structure, that a nation without law was no nation at all. He could not have imagined, in those quiet years of chalk dust and case citations, that by the summer of 1944, he would be standing in a bombed-out street in Cherbourg, France, listening to the sound of his own world ending. The Wehrmacht had come for him in 1942, the way it came for nearly every able-bodied man in Germany by that stage of the war. There was no negotiating with a draft notice. Hallstein, then in his early 40s, was assigned to an artillery regiment stationed in northern France, part of the vast defensive network Berlin called the Atlantic Wall. For 2 years he drilled his men, checked his guns, and waited for an invasion that German intelligence insisted would come, though nobody could say exactly when or where. It came on the 6th of June, 1944. From his position, Hallstein did not see the first landings at Normandy. He heard about them the way most of the German army did, in fragments, through officers pale with disbelief, through radio transmissions that grew more frantic by the hour. But within days, the war came looking for him directly. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, driving toward the vital deep-water port of Cherbourg, Hallstein's unit was pulled into the fighting retreat, one of thousands of German formations trying to hold a line that had already, in every meaningful sense, collapsed. What he witnessed in those final weeks of June would stay with him long after the guns fell silent. From high ground above the coast, in the days before his capture, he watched the English Channel fill with an armada that seemed to have no edges. Warships stretched to the horizon in every direction he looked. Landing craft moved in formations too dense to count. Above them, the sky churned with aircraft, wave after wave, more planes in a single afternoon than the Luftwaffe could field in a month by that point in the war. Hallstein had been trained to think of the Reich's enemies as fractured, exhausted, incapable of the kind of coordinated industrial mobilization that Germany itself had achieved in the first years of the war. What he saw from that hillside did not match the lecture he had been given by his own government. It did not match anything he had been told to expect, and it did not leave his mind for the rest of his life. He said nothing to his men about what he suspected. There was no time, and there was no use. The German garrison at Cherbourg, ordered by Hitler himself to hold the port to the last man, fought a battle it could not win. Allied artillery and naval gunfire pounded the old stone fortifications for days without pause. The city's fortress walls, built to withstand the sieges of another century, crumbled under a kind of firepower that belonged to a different age of warfare entirely. By the 26th of June 1944, Organized resistance inside Cherbourg had disintegrated into isolated, exhausted pockets of starving men, still holding rifles out of habit more than hope. Hallstein's unit was one of them. When the order finally came, whether from a superior officer or from the plain arithmetic of a battle already lost, he laid down his weapon. American soldiers took him into custody amid the wreckage of a city that no longer resembled the town it had been 3 weeks earlier. He was one of tens of thousands of German prisoners captured in the Cherbourg pocket that summer, part of a wave of surrenders that would only grow larger as the Allied breakout from Normandy accelerated in the weeks that followed. What happened next unsettled him more than the battle itself. He had been raised, like every German soldier of his generation, on a steady diet of warnings about what awaited a man who fell into American or British hands. Prisoners, the propaganda insisted, could expect brutality, starvation, exploitation as forced labor, or worse. Some of the older men in his unit had muttered darkly, in the last hours before the surrender, about firing squads waiting on the other side of captivity. Instead, American military police searched him, processed him, and moved him into a holding area with a brisk, almost bureaucratic efficiency that felt entirely foreign after 2 years of wartime improvisation and shortage. Medical officers examined the prisoners one by one. Names and units were recorded in neat rows on printed forms. An American officer, speaking fluent German, explained the protections of the Geneva Convention in a flat, official tone, as though reciting a memorized regulation rather than delivering a threat or a favor. Hallstein, trained by years of legal practice to read a situation carefully, noticed the details others might have missed in their exhaustion. The Americans were not improvising. Every step of the process, from the intake paperwork to the size of the ration, followed a system that had clearly been designed, tested, and repeated many thousands of times before his own capture. It was the first small crack in a belief system that had, until that week, gone almost entirely unquestioned in his mind. The march away from the ruins of Cherbourg took him to a transit camp near the coast, one of many hastily built holding areas the Allies had constructed to process the flood of prisoners the Normandy campaign was producing far faster than anyone in Washington or London had originally planned for. The camp smelled of wet canvas and diesel fuel, of thousands of exhausted men packed into rows of tents under a sky that would not stop raining. At night, Hallstein lay awake listening to distant artillery, still audible even here, a reminder that the war he had just left behind was continuing without him, indifferent to whether he lived or died in its shadow. He thought often, in those first days of captivity, of his students back in Germany, of lecture halls that had likely gone silent, of a university system slowly being consumed by a war that showed no interest in sparing scholars any more than soldiers. From there, along with thousands of other German soldiers, he was moved toward a port to await transport across the Atlantic Ocean, toward a country he had never seen and had been taught, his entire adult life, to regard as decadent and doomed. The line of prisoners waiting to board stretched along the docks for what felt like miles, a slow, shuffling column of men in torn field gray, watched over by American guards who seemed, to Hallstein's surprise, almost bored by the routine of it. There was no shouting, no theater of cruelty, only the low murmur of men speaking quietly among themselves, the creak of gear, the distant clang of dock machinery loading cargo onto ships bound in both directions across an ocean that suddenly felt smaller than it should have. The ship that would carry him to America was, in every visible respect, unremarkable. It was simply one of the thousands of Liberty ships the United States had been producing at a pace that defied belief. Cargo vessels built not for elegance but for speed and volume, welded together from prefabricated steel sections at shipyards that had barely existed before the war began. Some of these ships, Hallstein would come to learn, were completed from keel to launch in a matter of days rather than months, an industrial feat with no equivalent anywhere inside the Reich, where steel, labor, and time had all grown scarce in equal measure. Rather than sail back to America empty, After delivering troops and supplies to the European theater, the United States Navy filled the returning holds with prisoners of war, a logistical decision made purely out of efficiency that would, in its own quiet way, become one of the most effective instruments of psychological transformation the entire war would produce. The crossing took roughly 2 weeks. For a man who had spent 2 years anticipating an Allied invasion and the last several weeks fighting a losing defense of a doomed port city, the ocean crossing offered something he had not expected: time to think, and food he had not seen in years. The rations aboard ship, standard issue for prisoners under American military control, included fresh bread, real coffee, and meat servings that exceeded what his own artillery unit had received in its final months in France. He was, by any measure, still a prisoner, still a captured enemy of the nation that now controlled his fate. But he was a prisoner who was, for the first time since the war began, eating better than he had as a free soldier of the Wehrmacht standing guard on the Atlantic Wall. Hallstein kept his observations to himself. He was a cautious man by temperament, trained by years of legal practice to withhold judgment until the evidence was complete. But somewhere in the gray water of the mid-Atlantic, watching gulls trail behind a ship built in days by workers his own government had insisted for years were on the verge of economic collapse, the first serious doubt took root in him. It was not yet a conviction. It was only a question, quiet and persistent, the kind that does not go away simply because a man refuses to say it out loud. Around him, other prisoners were asking the same question in their own private ways. Men who had fought in the deserts of North Africa and the hedgerows of Normandy alike found themselves staring out at an ocean that no longer felt like a boundary between two worlds, but a passage into one they did not understand. Whatever waited on the other side, it was already clear to Hallstein that it would not resemble anything the Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin had prepared him to expect. He did not know it yet, but that quiet question would follow him across an entire continent, into a prisoner of war camp deep in the American South, and eventually, more than a decade later, into the marble halls of a new Europe he would help design from the ashes of the one he had just watched fall. The ship made landfall on the Atlantic coast of the United States after roughly 2 weeks at sea, and the first sight of America did more damage to Hallstein's assumptions than the entire crossing had. The harbor sprawled outward in every direction, cranes swinging overhead in long mechanical arcs, dozens of vessels being loaded and unloaded at once with a rhythm that never seemed to pause for breath. Trucks moved in steady columns along the docks. Stacks of crates rose in neat towers taller than the warehouses beside them. Somewhere beyond the piers, smoke rose from stacks that never stopped burning, and the air itself carried the mingled smell of salt water, diesel fuel, and fresh-cut lumber stacked in mountains along the wharves. Nothing about the scene suggested a nation exhausted by war. Everything about it suggested a nation that had barely begun to exert itself. The prisoners were formed into columns and marched toward waiting trains, and it was here, in the ordinary details of the American workforce around him, that Hallstein began noticing things he could not easily explain away. Dock workers wore leather boots in good repair, boots that in Germany would have cost a laborer 2 months of wages. Many carried lunch pails that, when opened during a break, revealed meat sandwiches, fruit, and coffee in thermoses, food that an ordinary German civilian in the summer of 1944 would have considered a small feast reserved for holidays. Rows of private automobiles filled a parking area near the port gates, vehicles belonging not to officers or party officials but, as an English-speaking guard casually explained, to laborers and clerks who drove themselves to work each morning. In Germany, private car ownership had remained largely the privilege of the wealthy and the politically connected throughout the war, and the promised people's car that Hitler's government had advertised for years to ordinary German families had, in practice, reached almost none of them. Here, in this one American port alone, it appeared to belong to almost anyone with a job, and the modest wages that came with it. What awaited the prisoners at the rail yard unsettled Hallstein more than anything he had seen at the docks. He had expected boxcars, the same cramped freight wagons that had carried German troops across occupied Europe for years, marked with the grim, joking shorthand of 40 men or 8 horses stenciled on their sides. Instead, the prisoners boarded passenger coaches with upholstered seating, cars built for civilian travel rather than military transport, complete with overhead racks for luggage and windows that opened to let in the summer air. It was, by any measure, an absurd comfort to extend to captured enemy soldiers, and more than one man in Hallstein's car muttered that it had to be some kind of trick, a temporary show designed to be photographed and then withdrawn once the cameras were gone. No such reversal came. The train simply pulled away from the coast and began its long journey south and west, carrying its cargo of defeated soldiers deeper into a country that seemed, mile after mile, to contradict everything he had spent years being told was true. The journey took several days, and for Hallstein, trained to notice patterns and draw conclusions from evidence, those days became a slow, cumulative dismantling of everything he thought he understood about his enemy. Small towns rolled past the windows in an unbroken procession, and nearly all of them, even in the middle of the night, glowed with electric light. Street lamps burned on quiet corners where no one was walking. Shop windows stayed illuminated long after the shops themselves had closed for the evening, displaying goods, appliances, and clothing to an empty sidewalk as if electricity itself cost nothing at all. In Germany, blackout regulations had been enforced since the earliest months of the war, turning entire cities dark after sunset as a defense against Allied bombers, and rural electrification even before the war had reached only a modest fraction of German farms and villages. Here, in towns whose names Hallstein did not recognize and would likely never see again, electricity seemed to flow without limit or concern, as if the entire concept of scarcity had simply never been introduced to this part of the world. The train passed factories running through the night, their windows lit, their parking lots full even at hours when German industrial workers would long since have gone home under curfew. Somewhere along the route, a guard pointed out a sprawling aircraft plant visible for miles by its own electric glow, telling the prisoners, almost as an afterthought, that plants like it elsewhere in the country could finish a 4-engine bomber in about the time it took the train to travel between 2 stations. Hallstein did not know whether to believe the number. He would spend months turning it over in his mind before deciding that disbelief, at this point, was simply another form of denial. The train passed grain elevators standing along riverbanks, structures larger than many of the churches Hallstein had grown up attending, holding more wheat than he could easily estimate from a moving window. It passed farmland that stretched to the horizon in every direction, worked not by teams of laborers and horses, but by machinery that a lone farmer's son could operate alone from a padded seat. At one stop for water and coal, Hallstein watched railway workers refuel the train in a fraction of the time such an operation would have taken in Germany, using automated equipment that seemed built for a different, faster century entirely, one that had somehow arrived in rural America years ahead of schedule. He said little to the other prisoners in his car, most of whom stared out the windows in a silence that had less to do with military discipline than with the particular kind of shock that comes from watching a lifetime of assumptions dissolve in real time. Hallstein, the trained lawyer, found himself doing what he had always done best, gathering evidence, weighing it, and slowly, reluctantly, reaching a conclusion his training told him he could not avoid. If this was what an ordinary American landscape looked like in wartime, then the propaganda he had absorbed for over a decade was not simply exaggerated. It was, in its most essential claims, false, and he began to wonder, somewhere in the dark hours of that long journey, what else he had been taught to believe that would not survive contact with plain observation. The train's final destination was Camp Como, one of several prisoner-of-war camps constructed across the state of Mississippi to house the growing population of German soldiers captured in North Africa and, increasingly by the summer of 1944, in the fighting across France. Built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, the camp had originally been designed to hold several thousand prisoners, most of them veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps who had surrendered in Tunisia the year before. Hardened desert fighters who had already spent a year adjusting to American captivity by the time Hallstein arrived from Normandy. He stepped off the train into a wall of thick, humid Mississippi heat, so different from the cool, gray skies of northern France that for a moment it seemed like another kind of disorientation entirely, as though the ship had carried him not just across an ocean, but into an entirely different climate of the mind. Hallstein arrived to find a camp already functioning with the same quiet efficiency he had noticed everywhere since his capture: rows of wooden barracks fitted with electric lighting, functioning plumbing, and heating that worked reliably even as the season eventually turned colder. Comforts that many rural German households had gone without even before the war began stripping the country of resources. Guard towers stood at intervals along a perimeter fence, but inside that fence the daily rhythm of the camp felt closer to a small, self-contained town than to the punitive institution he had braced himself for during the long train ride south. Life inside the wire followed a rhythm that surprised nearly every new arrival. Meals were served on a fixed schedule and included fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and milk in quantities that exceeded what German civilians, and often German soldiers, had been receiving for years by that stage of the war. The camp infirmary was stocked with medical supplies that stunned the German doctors and medics among the prisoner population, including penicillin, an antibiotic that remained desperately scarce in the Wehrmacht's own field hospitals, and was, in the closing years of the war, essentially unavailable to ordinary German soldiers wounded at the front. It was administered to prisoners with minor infections as a matter of routine treatment, not as an exceptional mercy, a fact that some of the camp's German medical staff found almost impossible to process after years of watching comrades die from wounds that, here, would have been treated in an afternoon and forgotten within a week. For a man like Hallstein, however, the detail that mattered most was not the food or the medicine, but what the American camp authorities allowed him to do with his mind. Under regulations shaped by the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could not be compelled to labor in support of the enemy's war effort, but they could, if camp administrators approved, organize educational and recreational activities among themselves. Hallstein, a trained legal scholar with years of university lecturing behind him, petitioned the camp command for permission to teach. The request was approved with a bureaucratic ease that, by this point, no longer surprised him as much as it once would have, though it still struck him as faintly absurd that the same nation holding him behind barbed wire was now supplying him with paper, pencils, and a room in which to lecture. What grew out of that permission became, informally, a small university inside the wire. Hallstein organized law courses for fellow prisoners, drawing on whatever texts and materials the camp library and American educational programs could provide, teaching legal theory and civil procedure to men who, only months earlier, had been soldiers of an army built on the wholesale rejection of the rule of law he had spent his career studying. Other prisoners with academic or professional backgrounds organized their own courses alongside his, in languages, in mathematics, in the sciences, until the camp had assembled, almost by accident, something resembling a functioning institution of higher learning, built entirely by the prisoners themselves, with quiet encouragement rather than obstruction from their captors. Attendance was voluntary, and yet the classes filled steadily as the weeks passed, as though men who had spent years being told what to think were suddenly hungry for the discipline of being asked to reason for themselves again. The irony was not lost on Hallstein, and it would not have been lost on any of his students either. He had been captured as an enemy combatant, stripped of his rank in any practical sense, held behind fences under armed guard, and yet he had more freedom to think, read, write, and teach inside Camp Como than he had enjoyed in the final years of a Germany where universities had been steadily purged of independent thought and bent to the service of ideology. The prisoners who attended his classes were, in a very real sense, receiving an education that the collapsing Reich could no longer offer its own citizens, delivered inside a fenced compound in rural Mississippi by a man the fence was built to contain. Beyond the classroom, life at Camp Como settled into a routine that most of the prisoners, Hallstein included, could not have imagined during the desperate final weeks of the Normandy campaign. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be assigned to labor outside the camp so long as the work did not directly support the American war effort. And by the autumn of 1944, with so many American men serving overseas, the labor shortage across the rural South and Midwest had grown severe enough that German prisoners were routinely trucked out to farms and processing plants during harvest season. Hallstein, as an officer, was not required to join these labor details, but he often walked to the fence line in the evenings to watch the trucks return, and he listened closely to what the enlisted men reported when they climbed down, dust on their boots and a look on their faces that he had come to recognize. They spoke of fields that stretched farther than a man could walk in a day, of combine harvesters that did the work of what would have required 100 men and horses back home, of farmers, ordinary men with no rank and no political standing, who nonetheless owned tractors, trucks, and telephones, and who spoke casually of yields per acre that exceeded anything German soil had produced, even before the war stripped away fertilizer, fuel, and labor alike. One enlisted man, a former baker's apprentice from Westphalia, told Hallstein that the farmer he had been assigned to work for had apologized for the tractor being an older model, explaining that a newer one was on order from the manufacturer. The apology itself, delivered without irony to a captured enemy soldier, said more to Hallstein about the depth of American abundance than any number could have. The camp also received, through official channels, a small but steady supply of American newspapers and specially prepared reading material intended for German prisoners, part of a broader program the United States War Department had quietly begun developing to expose POWs to democratic ideas and accurate war reporting, as a counterweight to years of Nazi indoctrination. Hallstein read these papers carefully, comparing the reporting to what he remembered from the tightly controlled press back home. He noticed, with the same lawyer's attention to detail that had served him on the train south, that the American papers printed criticism of their own government, published casualty figures without disguising them, and allowed contradictory opinions to sit side by side on the same page. In Germany, such open self-criticism would have been treated as treason. Here, it appeared to be treated as simply part of how a free press was supposed to function, and the strength of a nation confident enough to tolerate its own critics was not lost on a man who had spent his career studying the architecture of governments. Discussions among the prisoners, once dominated by die-hard defenders of the Nazi cause, began to shift almost imperceptibly as the months passed. Hallstein noticed that the loudest ideologues in the camp had grown quieter, no longer arguing when confronted with production figures or eyewitness accounts from labor details, while a growing number of men, particularly the younger ones, began asking questions in his law classes that went well beyond legal theory, questions about how a federal system balanced power, about what protections an ordinary citizen held against his own government, about whether the rule of law he taught could ever function inside a country still governed by racial hierarchy and unchecked authority. He answered carefully, aware that every word he spoke inside that classroom was, in its own small way, a rehearsal for a Germany that did not yet exist but that he had, almost without noticing, begun to imagine building. As the year turned toward winter, the camp prepared for a holiday that few of the prisoners had expected to spend on American soil. Christmas of 1944 arrived with a set of gestures that many of the men found harder to reconcile with their old beliefs than any factory or grain elevator had been. Local churches and civic groups from towns near the camp sent care packages containing candy, cigarettes, and handwritten cards, small tokens of goodwill extended to men who had, until recently, been fighting against sons, brothers, and husbands from those very same communities scattered across Mississippi and beyond. Camp administrators permitted a modest holiday meal, turkey and dressing served alongside vegetables and pie in quantities that startled men who could still remember rationed Christmases at home. And for one evening, the barracks filled with a strange, quiet warmth that had nothing to do with propaganda and everything to do with simple, unforced decency extended by strangers with no obligation to offer it. For men raised on Nazi doctrine that divided the world into racial hierarchies and painted America as a mongrel nation too divided and too soft to sustain a real war effort, this kindness was, in its own way, more destabilizing than any statistic about steel production or aircraft output could have been. It was one thing to be shown that the enemy possessed more resources. It was another thing entirely to be shown that the enemy, despite every reason for bitterness, chose to treat defeated men with basic human warmth at a time when the war in Europe was still grinding through its final brutal winter. Hallstein, watching this unfold from the position of a man who had spent his professional life studying how societies organize themselves around principles rather than force, began to suspect that what he was witnessing was not weakness dressed up as generosity, but the quiet confidence of a nation secure enough in its own strength to extend mercy without calculation or fear of appearing soft. News from the front reached the camp steadily through those winter months. Filtered through American newspapers and radio broadcasts the prisoners were now permitted to hear. They learned of the German offensive through the Ardennes forest in December, and for a brief week or two, something like the old confidence flickered through parts of the camp, a hope that the war might yet turn. It did not last. By January, the news had turned grim again. The offensive broken. German reserves spent on a gamble that had bought nothing but more dead men and a shorter road to the Rhine for the armies now closing in from both east and west. Hallstein followed the reports with the same detached, evidentiary discipline he brought to everything else, and he found that the collapse of the Ardennes offensive troubled him less as a soldier mourning a lost battle than as a lawyer watching a case built on false premises finally, inevitably, fall apart in open court. By the early months of 1945, camp administrators and American military officials overseeing the prisoner of war system had begun identifying certain men among the German POW population for a different kind of program entirely, one aimed not merely at humane treatment, but at active preparation for the world that would exist after the war ended. Candidates were selected based on education, demeanor, and a documented absence of fanatical Nazi sympathies, screened carefully by American officers who had spent months quietly observing how each man conducted himself inside the wire, who he associated with, what he read, and how he responded to the evidence of American life laid out in front of him every single day. Hallstein, with his academic credentials, his demonstrated willingness to organize and teach, and his evident interest in the structures of governance rather than the machinery of war, was exactly the kind of prisoner such a program had been designed to find. He did not yet know what the selection would mean, only that his name had been added to a list, and that within weeks he would be transferred away from Camp Como, away from the humid Mississippi evenings and the small classroom he had built almost by accident, to a facility in a part of the country he had never heard of, to study subjects that, only a year earlier, would have gotten a German officer arrested for even possessing the books involved. The war that had taken his students, his university post, and very nearly his life was, without any apparent irony on the part of his captors, about to hand him an entirely new education, delivered by the same nation whose industrial might had already dismantled almost everything he once believed about strength, weakness, and the true measure of a civilization. He packed the few belongings he had accumulated inside the wire, said quiet goodbyes to the students he had taught through a Mississippi autumn and winter, and boarded another train, uncertain what waited at the end of the line, certain only that whatever it was, it would not be what the Ministry of Propaganda had once promised him about the enemy he had come to know. The facility Hallstein arrived at was nothing like Camp Como. Fort Getty sat on a narrow spit of land in Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, a former coastal defense installation converted, quietly and without public announcement, into one of the most unusual classrooms the United States Army had ever assembled. There were no crops to harvest here, no factories visible from a train window, only cold Atlantic wind, a scattering of low buildings, and a small, carefully screened group of German prisoners selected from camps across the country for a single purpose: to be taught, in intensive detail, how a democracy actually worked. The program was called, in the plain bureaucratic language the Army preferred, the Administration School. Over a course of roughly 60 days, Hallstein and a few dozen other selected prisoners studied the American federal Constitution, the separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, the mechanics of local government, and the practical administrative skills that an occupied, war-shattered Germany would soon require of its own citizens. The instructors were academics drawn from some of the country's leading universities, men who lectured to former Wehrmacht officers with the same rigor they would have brought to any graduate seminar, treating their audience not as defeated enemies to be managed, but as future administrators whose competence would matter a great deal to the peace that was coming. For Hallstein, the experience arrived with a strange, quiet vertigo. He had spent his entire adult life studying law, and here, on a windswept peninsula in a country he had been raised to despise, he was being taught the architecture of a system built on principles almost entirely opposite to the one he had served in uniform. A system where power was deliberately fractured and checked rather than concentrated and obeyed, where courts could rule against the government that created them, where a free press was treated as a structural necessity rather than a threat to be managed. He took notes with the same careful hand he had once used to prepare his own lectures in Frankfurt, filling notebook after notebook with a framework he could not yet know he would spend the next decade of his life helping to build into something larger than either Germany or America had ever attempted. The other prisoners in his cohort noticed the shift in him too, the way he stayed after lectures to ask further questions, the way he began sketching, almost idly at first, comparisons between American federalism and the patchwork of German states that had existed before their forced unification under a single, totalitarian will. Some of what he was learning felt less like instruction and more like recognition, as though the ideas being presented to him were answers to questions he had been quietly formulating since a rain-soaked transit camp near Cherbourg, since a train car window in the Mississippi night, since a Christmas dinner served to him by people who owed him nothing but decency. The days at Fort Getty followed a discipline of their own: lectures in the morning, seminar discussion in the afternoon, and long evenings spent reading in a library stocked with texts that would have been confiscated and burned in the Germany he had left behind. He and his fellow students debated late into the night about what kind of federal structure might actually suit a defeated Germany once occupation ended, about how much power should rest with the states, and how much with a central government still untested and unproven, about whether a nation that had so recently worshipped a single absolute authority could be taught, in the span of a few short years, to distribute power instead of concentrating it. These were not idle academic exercises. Every man in that room understood, with a clarity that had not existed a year earlier, that the answers they arrived at might shape the actual government under which their own families would live. Rhode Island in the late winter and early spring of 1945 bore little resemblance to the humid Mississippi countryside he had left behind. Cold, salt wind came off the bay most mornings, and the prisoners walked between buildings in coats the Army had issued without complaint or comment, warm wool against a New England chill that felt, after the desert campaigns and the Normandy hedgerows, almost peaceful. It was an unlikely setting for the kind of reckoning that was unfolding inside him, a quiet military outpost on a quiet stretch of coastline, and yet Hallstein would later come to see it as the place where the outline of the rest of his life first became visible, sketched out not in ambition but in the plain, patient accumulation of evidence he could no longer refuse to believe. News from Germany reached the school in fragments throughout the spring of 1945, and none of it was easy to hear. In April, American and British forces liberated concentration camps across the collapsing Reich, and photographs and newsreel footage of what they found there began circulating, first among the American staff and then, deliberately, among the German prisoners themselves. Hallstein watched the footage along with the other men in his cohort in a silence that had nothing performative about it. Some prisoners refused at first to believe what they were seeing, insisting it had to be fabricated, propaganda dressed up as evidence. But the evidence did not relent, and within days, corroborating testimony from American soldiers, official military reports, and eventually letters filtering out of occupied Germany made denial impossible for any man still capable of reasoning honestly. For Hallstein, the revelation did not simply confirm doubts he had been nursing since his capture. It reframed everything else he had witnessed over the past year in a darker, more urgent light. The abundance he had marveled at on that train south, the kindness he had received at Christmas, the intellectual freedom he had been given inside a prisoner of war camp. None of it had been a trick or a temporary performance staged for defeated enemies. It had been the ordinary functioning of a society organized around something Nazi Germany had never valued, and had, as the camp footage now proved beyond argument, actively and systematically despised the basic dignity of human beings. He had not simply been shown a wealthier country. He had been shown, in painstaking and now horrifying contrast, exactly what his own country had chosen to become while he manned an artillery position on the Atlantic coast, believing he was defending something worth defending. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and the news reached Fort Getty, not as celebration, but as a strange, exhausted stillness. There was no defiance left among the prisoners, no talk of a war that might still somehow be won. What remained instead was a quieter, harder question, one that Hallstein and his classmates spent their final weeks at the administration school turning over with genuine seriousness. What kind of Germany could possibly be built from the wreckage that remained, and whether men like themselves, tainted by service to a regime whose crimes they were only now fully comprehending, had any legitimate role left to play in building it. The American instructors at Fort Getty seemed to believe the answer was yes, and they said so plainly, without sentimentality. Germany would need administrators, lawyers, and civil servants who understood both their own country's traditions and the democratic principles that occupying authorities intended to help implant there. Men who had proven, through their conduct as prisoners, that they were capable of genuine reflection rather than mere sullen defeat, were exactly the men the American military government would need as partners in the years of reconstruction ahead. It was not absolution. It was something more practical and, in its own way, more demanding, an invitation to spend the rest of his life proving that the lessons of the past year had actually changed him. Hallstein was repatriated to Germany in November of 1945, sailing back across the same ocean that had carried him to captivity a little more than a year earlier, though the man who made that return crossing bore only a passing resemblance to the artillery officer who had surrendered amid the rubble of Cherbourg. He arrived in a country that scarcely resembled the one he had left, cities reduced to broken silhouettes, a population hungry, displaced and uncertain, an economy that would take years simply to stop shrinking. And yet he arrived carrying something almost no other returning German soldier possessed in quite the same form: a detailed, first-hand understanding of how a large, diverse federal democracy actually functioned in practice, gained not from books alone, but from more than a year spent inside the machinery of one, first as its prisoner, and then, unofficially, as its student. What followed in the years after his return would eventually place Walter Hallstein at the center of one of the 20th century's most consequential political projects. He returned to academic life first, resuming the kind of legal scholarship that had defined his career before the war, before moving steadily into the world of diplomacy and post-war reconstruction that his experience in American captivity had, in its own strange way, prepared him for better than almost anyone could have predicted. By the 1950s, he had become one of West Germany's leading voices on European integration, helping negotiate the treaties that would knit together a continent still scarred by the war he had fought in and by the atrocities he had first confronted, fully and undeniably, on a cold Rhode Island evening in the spring of 1945. In 1958, Walter Hallstein became the first president of the Commission of the European Economic Community, the institutional forerunner of what would eventually become the European Union. The man who had once stood on a hillside above the Normandy coast, watching an Allied armada that seemed to prove everything he had been taught was a lie, now sat at the head of an institution built explicitly to ensure that the kind of catastrophic, industrialized warfare he had witnessed and survived would never again be allowed to consume the continent that had produced it. It was, in the truest sense, a life built on the wreckage of the one it replaced. And it had begun, however improbably, in a column of defeated men marched out of a burning port city, prisoners of a nation whose industrial might had shattered every illusion they carried, and whose quiet, unglamorous decency had rebuilt something in its place that no army could ever have delivered on its own.